The smell of incense in the corridor clings to clothes like dust to cloth. Hemlines rustle in the narrow openings between the stone walls, and every movement is as audible as an empty staircase. Within these walls, rumors run faster than torches. Names of favorites are called. Colors of belts are enumerated. Intentions are attributed to looks. But at the gates of the halls are eunuchs with sticks of order. At the tables are scribes with plaques, and on the hangers are tags with the hours of audience. Rumors rest against protocol like water against a curb. Higher up, they do not overflow. Where the crowd wants an affair, the chancery issues a schedule. Who stands where? How many steps to the throne? What collar is on whose dress? And on what day cloth with gold thread is allowed? Dear audience, I welcome you. Write where you are looking from, and what you think is true about the stories of the promiscuous court. It's important for me to see your geography in the comments. Different cities hear different legends. I wish you a pleasant listening experience. We will analyze the palace etiquette of body and clothes through the eyes of an adult author who knew the hall from the inside, not as a place of secret games, but as a machine of ceremonies. On one pole is the myth of irrepressible intrigue. On the other is paper, schedules, closet registers, and a succession of posts where every gesture is a formula. The stone corridors of the Grand Palace are organized as a bookkeeping of power. There is a way for ambassadors, a way for relatives, a way for monastic abbots. There is a time when the empress goes out to pray, and a time when the female retinue passes to the chambers. Anna Komnene, an adult woman at court, shows in her records that what matters is not desire but frame. Clothing here is not skin, but a document. The length of the sleeve, the pattern of the patch, the shape of the veil, the degree of luster of the threads, all speak of rank and commission. Where gossip seeks a challenge to propriety, the closet register responds with the date of issue, the occasion, and the person responsible. And if a rumored favorite appears out of measure, the audience schedule reminds us. Out of measure, these days there is simply no place to stand, and the road to the hall is blocked by the ceremony guard. The machinery of protocol is particularly conspicuous in details that the ordinary eye misses. The women of the court, adult and trained, enter the hall only after the ceremoniary signal. Veils are layered to hide their hair, but show the edge of the pattern due to rank. Hands are held at waist level. The step is measured so that the cloth does not touch the floor unnecessarily. The servants check the light so that the golden thread does not blind the ambassadors. Behind their backs stands a scribe who makes notes on the beginning and end of the reception, on the gifts and oaths brought. In this dryness, the body is given the role of sign-bearer. Whoever tries to read promiscuity in this is confusing the alphabet. If the pattern on the collar is different today, it means that the addressee of the audience has changed, not the intention of the eye. The opposition to the empress likes to work through whispers. The pamphlets hit not the decisions, but the clothes. They write that the color is too bright, that the steps seemed light, that the gaze lingers. But the pamphlets break against the duty board. On days of festivities, the empress stands in an entourage where distances and angles are set in advance. Next to her are the adult women of the entourage. Behind them, the eunuchs of order. The distance between the rows is not a field for play, but a guarantee that the ambassador's word will not mingle with the whispers of the crowd. Each layer of clothing has a name and a keeper, each piece of jewelry, a sealed box and a line of issue. If the accusation concerns improper bling, the closet archive pulls out a record. To whom and for what cloth was issued, who accepted and when returned, what holiday was celebrated, at what hour the outing was scheduled. Anna sets the female gaze not as a confessional, but as an inventory of propriety. Her pages are dry where one expects passion. She notes that measure is especially valued at court because measure keeps the court from becoming a marketplace. In her narrative, the body is not an occasion, but a knot of obligations. It is obliged to be covered according to rank, to move along a trajectory calculated to give the right impression and security. The gazes so insisted upon by the gossipers are equal to emptiness in such a device. If light falls from a certain window, the eyes look where the ambassador stands, not where the narrator would like them to. This is not a novel, but geometry. There are no extra steps from the carpet to the throne. The dryness of the courtyard does not cancel out the brutality of the world outside the walls. Diseases roam the neighborhoods. Winters break the backs of porters. Spring floods carry shops off the embankment. This is why the protocol is so harsh. It wards off power from chaos, making of the Empress's exit not an event of the body, but an event of form. A woman's closet, easily thought of as a toy, is, within these walls, an instrument of politics. Stability is read through the fabric. If the pattern and length are unchanged, it means that the army will receive its wages, the tax its ration, the ships their cargo. Rumors of promiscuity try to hit this very mark of stability, to tear the fabric away from function and glue a story of desire to it. The archive responds with lines and seals. What? When? For what reason? The yard is not blind to human envy. That is why the registers of penalties for libel lie beside the closet books. Their sheets are like account books. Name, position, charge, schedule check, fine or removal from appointments. There are no colors here, only rhythm. The female perspective is neither defeat nor victory, but a quiet fixation. To maintain dignity, it is enough to hold the form. A grown woman's body does not become an object of bargaining as long as its covering is subject to protocol, and as long as a scribe with a sandbox stands behind its edge, ready to record who and when tried to turn the fabric into an occasion for a pamphlet. The myth of Byzantium as a profligate court is convenient because it promises quick access to secrecy. The document shatters that promise. It shows ladders, duty stands, keys to chests, seals on bundles, names of keepers. Where rumor demands spectacle, the archive produces a bill. And this account shows the main thing. The female gaze, armed with the knowledge of protocol, does not romanticize power, but sobered it up. It shows how fabric and pacing become the language of the institution, and how this language outlasts the pamphlets. In the next movement, we see how scandals are broken by the schedules of audiences. Hours, corners, passageways, entrance control. The same cold mechanism that cannot accept legends, but can register presence. The schedules of palace audiences show the backbone to which gossip always lost. Each week had its own nodes. Days for foreign embassies, days for the synclitic, days for prayers, days when the female retinue accompanied the empress to the ceremonial exits between the temple and the chambers. It was not corridors that connected the passages, but sequences of actions. The veil opens, the servant raises the lantern, the ceremoniarius shows the gesture, eunuchs form the gaps, scribes mark the beginning and end. When the word secret meeting flashed up in the urban colloquialism, the register of motion showed that at that hour the parade line ran from the portico to the hall and back again without side branches. To get out of it required breaking the formula, and this at once left a trace in the service sheets. The garlands of lamps and carpets did not hide the footsteps. They counted them. Closet books served as a second filter. They did not contain ornaments for the sake of ornaments. For each outing, the fabric, color, border width, number of rows of embroidery, and type of coverlet were specified, with the record accompanied by the mark of the craftswoman and the name of the keeper of the chest. The female figures of the court, adult and professional, were obliged to obey these forms as strictly as a military commander obeys the camp regulations. If, On the eve of the celebrations, someone tried to plant a story about defiance of manners. The census of outfits answered with a dry line. From the chest was issued such and such a set on such and such an occasion, returned at such and such an hour, seals intact. In this way, the intrigue fell out of the fabric. The fabric became a carrier of rank, not of plot. Especially revealing is how protocol inscribed female labor and female responsibility. Mentors at quarters taught movement and discipline as much as teachers on the formation taught formation. A hand was not to attract attention. A step was not to break the distance. A glance was not to cross the trajectory of the ambassadors. Entrances and exits were lined up so that the value of the body as a symbol of power was not turned into someone else's coin. The female gaze, coming to chronicle through the author's experience, captured just that. The glide of the fabric along a pre-calculated line, the light on the embroidery exactly as required for a sign of stability, and not a fraction of a wishbone more. Not passion, but a calibrated display of a world where vanity is dangerous because it breaks the schedule and hurts the cause. The pamphlet against the Empress always sought a shortcut to the heart of the crowd. The shortest road went through attributing meanings to gestures that were not there. A lightness of step was called frivolity. A change of shade of cloth was called insolence. A tilt of the head a signal. But on the other side lay the guards' logs, where passages and delays were recorded. There was also information about who and when tried to enter the hall without a mark, who was reprimanded, who was taken aside. In these notebooks, carelessness was broken down into fatigue after standing for a long time, or tightness due to overcrowded corridors. A sign of courtesy to the ambassador, which gossip called a secret sign, stood in the journal as an obligatory slant on protocol. The machine of order did not understand whispers. It spoke with time and distance. The yard was a place not only of brilliance, but of painful labor. Belts too tight rubbed the shoulders of the maids. The cold of the marble floors broke the knees. The heat from the lamps dried the eyes. The heavy cloths pulled the backs. The doctor's notes kept at the back tables told of dizziness during long services, of sprains from endless bowing, of inflammations from the gilded threads that left dust. These notes did not make the courtyard a hospital, but they gave the protocol another meaning. The measure of dress and the measure of movement were not only the speech of power, but also the protection of people. Violation of the measure cost injuries and disrupted audiences, which was already a political mistake. The female gaze saw here not a whim, but the price of stability. Every extra fold was an extra pain, every extra step an extra risk. The confrontation between the opposition and the chancellery became especially acute when the sheets with lists of allegedly indecent episodes were in circulation. Sheets walked around the shops, but at the gates of the palace met them with a checklist: names, hours, the purpose of the hall, the composition of those present, a record of lamps and porters, a note about the duty of eunuchs. One by one, the events fell out of the 24 hours, like sand from one's fingers. At these hours, the Empress was at prayer. At these hours, the council sat. At these hours, monks were received. At these hours, vestments were sewed. Those who tried to tie stories of secret moves to these hours ran into the emptiness of the schedule. Emptiness is the coldest answer. It destroys even eloquent anger because it has print and time on its side. The closet archive gave another line of defense: economic. The things of the court were not only symbols, but an expense that was written off line by line. The scribes had figures in words: how much silk went to renew the cuffs, how much gilded thread for the pattern, how much linen for the lining, how many candles to light the hall. Opposition sheets liked to cry, "Waste for whimsy's sake," but beside them lay estimates where every cubit of cloth was tied to the ceremony, every new gate to the visit. The reports made of beauty a score, and of the score a shield against fiction. The female eye could count as well as any treasurer. The chronicle felt it. What the crowd called a pose was listed in the estimate as the obligatory sign for the embassy, and that was the end of the conversation. It could not be denied that the court lived intrigue like air, but intrigue did not run on bodies, it ran on paper. The struggle for a place at the council table, for access to the ear of the sovereign, for the right to be the first to pass on the news, all this went on through the ladders of letters of recommendation and the binders of reports. The female retinue participated in this with a role that seems invisible but holds form, overseeing the accuracy of the exits, checking the integrity of the seals on the chests, replacing the coverlets in time after hours of services so that the cloth did not lose its mark. Where rumor measured power with the eyes, protocol measured it with seals. And if a scandal was born somewhere, it quickly became thin in the archives because it found no place in the registers. The turnaround happened every time someone else's story tried to squeeze into someone else's hour. So it was when the scandal tried to attribute to the solemn passage through the portico. In fact, at that hour, the carpet lay only on the center line, and the side aisles were empty because guards with chains were placed there. So it was with the other, conversation at the stove, which found a place in the kitchen bustle. The registers were brought in for these hours to serve the meal to the monastic guests, and access to the fire was denied without a pass. So it was with the hint of clothing. The check room recorded the issuing of a dark coverlet, which by code signified a mourning measure, not at all a desire to stand out. In these examples, repeated over and over again, the myth broke against the schedule like a wave against the embankment, and the female observer turned the motley story into a dull but unshakable list. The cruelty of the court was not manifested in debauchery, but in the discipline of punishment for breaking the mold. He who was a step late could be taken off duty for the season and deprived of part of his wages. The workshop that spoiled the boarder paid a penalty. The keeper who failed to notice a crack in the seal of a chest was suspended. This hurt the living people, and the chronicle did not hide it. Order was obtained by other people's fatigue. But it was this very brutality of form that left the gossiper little air. No obscenity could take place where the way to the hall was stamped by the step and gaze of dozens of witnesses in rows, where only the named and recorded reached the carpet. The conflict with the sheets would culminate on days when the opposition would launch a whole series of insinuations, attempting to storm the court from the street. The response was built not by shouting, but by layers of documents. The statutes of ceremonies, duty rosters, closet lists, guard logs, lighting registers, meal estimates. Paradoxically, it was the women's hands that held the keys to the chests and needles that contributed decisively to this barrier. Their signatures on the returns, their marks on the edge of the cloth, their notations of when the covers were switched, made history uncoordinated and thus impossible. The woman's gaze, which was said to untie everything, turned out to care for every loop so that it could not be untied without a trace. The chronicle went further and showed how the protocol survived even political storms. When the circle of counselors changed, the routes of entry were altered, but the logic of layers and distances did not disappear. When finances were reviewed, the gilded thread was cut, but the sign on the gate to admit foreigners was not cancelled. When diseases were weeded out by servants, the pews remained in their corners, and the lamps burned in their order. It seemed a dead stubbornness, but in that stubbornness was what resisted fiction. The myth demanded a living violation. The document responded with lifeless stubbornness. In this struggle, the woman chronicler did not make a heroine of herself. She was engaged in accounting won by not getting tired. As the years passed, the court's archive grew thicker, and each new attempt to pierce it whispered against the old walls. The grown women of those halls, accustomed to being visible and invisible at the same time, leave traces not unlike confessions, marks, seals, signatures, slits in the flaps of chests, faded labels. These, along with duty rosters and meal summaries, gather into a long line of negations, where each "said as if" is countered by a recorded that. This line is the female view of power, as understood by the author. Neither temptation nor fear, but work with a form that protects both the power itself and those who live under its vaults. Archival bundles, at first glance boring, became a map by which one could reconstruct any day at court with the precision of a lamp and a fold of cloth. On this map, one could clearly see how rumors swooned over empty seats, when a court lady's name was uttered in the stalls, and impossible itineraries attributed to her. The guard registers produced a sheaf of notes. At what hour she stood in the right-hand row at the portico when she crossed to the chambers, who accompanied her, which tutor carried a spare bedspread in case of a sudden wind that might knock down the line. These trifles withstood even a wicked fancy. For a fictitious scene to take place, it was necessary to remove several supports at once: the duty of the eunuchs, the signature on the issue of the keys to the chest, the note in the candle estimate, by which the duration of the exit was checked. The woman's eye, accustomed to cloth as a document, saw this relationship effortlessly, for on her palms remained the dust of gold from the threads, and the fine mesh from the ribbon seals, and all this texture spoke louder than a city whisper. The system guarded not innocence, but form, and thus power. Every ceremony turned the bodies of the adult women of the retinue into living signposts of the route. Steps set the width of the corridor. Turns made the height of the throne visible. The closing of the rows hid the transition between spaces from view. No haste was allowed, because haste tears the fabric of order. Where the pamphlet looked for evidence of the ease of manners, the accounting showed the drudgery of labor. How many times in one holiday outing the tutor changed the position of the coverlet to keep it from slipping? How many pins were returned with corrosion marks from sweat? How many stitches fell apart in the third hour of standing because of the coarse wool of the lining? Even this coarseness made sense. In the cold galleries, unnecessary softness led to cold, and cold led to a breakdown in duty, and a breakdown in duty led to a drop in the impression that the empire was broadcasting to the outside world. A dry chain of causes served as the best polemic against the poetry of secret signs and passions. The opposition, without access to these dull truths, worked in short blows. On days when the council was settling business matters, and the closet shop was receiving a new order for mending fringes, sheets appeared in the town, listing names, shades of fabrics, and as if an exchange of views. The machinery of the court responded, not with words, but with a reporting order. The chancellor would reset the clock, the ceremoniary would reconcile the security records, the closet would show the movement of materials, the treasurer, the movement of money. When the chain came together, the sheet was left unsupported. Sometimes the archives made a note of the source of the servile gossip, but more often they left the field blank. Blankness was the most accurate commentary on the emptiness of the accusation. The female chronicler's gaze recorded this silent way of refutation. The absence of a line, which meant more than any line, because the blank could not be faked or colored. Importantly, the protocol was not blind to the risks of its own rigor. In those seasons when disease crippled the servants, when the off-season brought damp cold, when new embassies layered one on top of the other, and lights burned longer than usual, palaces tweaked the itinerary. Some exits were shortened, some were moved to less windy passages, some were assigned to older and more experienced women whose movements were steadier. The doctor's notes taught not endurance at all costs, but reasonable measure. A belt that was too tight was replaced with a softer one, too heavy. Embroidery was placed not on the shoulders, but lower, to distribute the weight more evenly. These adjustments were entered into the same books as the issuing of cloth, and stood alongside the cost of repairing stone floors where leather soles slipped. Where legend saw caprice, the document showed adaptation to the strain. The discipline of the court did not deify pain. It took it into account, and that, oddly enough, knocked the ground even firmer from under stories of entertainment in the halls: fatigue, risk, responsibility, and penalties for failure, a bad stage for the legend of idleness. The sorest spot for gossip proved to be the audience hours. They sliced through the day like a knife through wax, leaving clean edges. It was impossible to squeeze a random scene into this rhythm without leaving a trace. To construct an ostensibly private look, it was necessary to undo the carpet markings and change the angles of light, and most importantly, to let an extra witness out of the room. But there were many witnesses at court: eunuchs of order, scribes, chest keepers, senior tutors, craftswomen, guards in the far aisles, cooks at the back doors. Their names were on duty rosters, and duty rosters were tied to wages, and every disappearance made a hole in the calculations. This money side was less visible to the city, but almost invulnerable. A blown shift meant a hole in the payroll, and a hole pulled a check. The sheet wouldn't hold up in a meeting with the accounting department. Anna methodically showed this dependence. Cloth and time do not exist separately. They are held together by money, and money likes order. An important layer that the female gaze added to this optic was a language of gestures within limits. Outwardly, it is poor. A step, a tilt, a raised hand, a delay at the threshold. Within the system, these minimal movements carry replicas that are understood by the initiated. A confirmation of the status of the embassy, a sign of the end of the prayer, an invitation to read petitions, an approval of the estimate. The misreading of these replicas by an outside observer is what generates the city's favorite stories. But in the archive, opposite each gesture, there is a sheet with its purpose. This tilt is obligatory for this holiday. This step is caused by the tightness of the corridor after the renovation. This pause is connected with moving the lamp. So every time the sheet ascribed too dense a meaning to a gesture, the protocol found a duller, but only acceptable explanation for it. It looked like a victory without brilliance, but in the long run, it was victories like this that created the image of the yard as a cold machine that could not be seduced or stratified. To be fair, the opposition did have one winning move: a moral contest. The pamphlet sometimes declared that the very possibility of such detailed regulation was already a spoilsport, as if women had been turned into automatons and clothes into harnesses. The archives answered this too, albeit indirectly. In the complaint books, there were cases of breach of propriety, not for the sake of passion, but for wanton rioting. Such cases were punished swiftly and harshly, and the verdict contained two words important to the whole theme: adulthood and responsibility. With this set, the court managed to turn a mirror. It was the clearly defined form that protected adult women from having their bodies become part of someone else's game. Documents did not speak of dignity and high style. They nailed it to the table with schedule and seal. In the end, the language of strict etiquette acted as a shield rather than a whip. When no one could demand the impossible, everyone stayed within the bounds where their decisions were verifiable. It becomes clear that the female gaze in this chronicle is not softness, but precision. It does not embellish, it measures. He fixes the distance between gossip and duty stand, between the shade of cloth and the line of responsibility, between look and duty. He does not deny the fact of the brutality of a system in which one is fined for disruption and suspended for cracking the seal. But that is why he knows the price of every rumor. If it does not contain hours and names, you have air in front of you. In such an optic, scandal ceases to be fire and becomes noise, drowned out by a lamp burning at the right hour and a step sounding in the right place. As the cases accumulated, the yard's immunity to the city's waves automatically grew as well. From week to week, from season to season, only the signs of foreign policy and economic needs changed. But the lattice on which the fabric of ceremonies was stretched did not disappear. New ambassadors brought different gifts. Farmsteads asked for different discounts. The treasurer changed the standards of lighting. Crafts, women rearranged the manner of sewing in favor of greater durability, and the rumors repeated the same story, as if somewhere in these changes there was a tread of the body. It was this repetition that gave away their artificiality. The archive had a great memory of yesterday, the day before yesterday, of years ago, and showed that everything was already there except the evidence. The female gaze smoothed out time like a dress and made the hall resistant to the dramas that not only people but also stones get tired of. The decisive attack on protocol came at a season when the town was weary of recent sicknesses and oil shortages, and the shops were quarreling over candle prices. The opposition chose a moment when the townspeople were eager to listen to any narrative that explained their weariness by someone else's sin. On the same day, thin sheets with the same matrix of accusations emerged from different printing rooms, listing the names of the adult women in the entourage, pointing out the shades of fabrics, hinting at the rhythm of footsteps and turns of the head. Inside, the same form was repeated, as if there were glitches outside the protocol, as if the audience schedule might leak. The sheets acted not as evidence, but as noise. Their power was speed and polyphony, but the machine of the court responded not with speed, but with synchronized slowness. Bundles of guard and duty logs were lifted in one place, closet books in another, lighting estimates in a third, doctor's reservations in a fourth. The four layers lay side by side, and together they formed a map of the day, where there was no free cell left for someone else's event. The first eliminator was time. The guard logs did not keep minute-by-minute records, but they recorded the beginning and end of all the key segments: the opening of the portico, the formation of the procession, the closing of the veils, the beginning and end of the audience, the changing of the lamps and the guards at the side doors. Any attempt to insert an extra gesture into this grid required disrupting at least one link, pushing back the closing of the veils a few moments, delaying the lamp change, shortening the interval at the threshold. But where something did shift, a trace was left in the expense of candles and oil cups, because the lamps burned longer than usual, and the treasurer asked questions. The Chronicle has learned this cold lesson over the years. Myth loves the moment, the document loves duration, and duration leaves expense. It was at the point of expense that any leaf broke. The second filter was the geometry of the halls. The sheets described supposedly vacant seats and corners without witnesses, but the aisles and carpet lines were calculated without voids. Designated eyes corresponded to each place. Eunuchs of order stood at one threshold, scribes at the second, female tutors at the third, watching the shape of the bedspreads and the width of the step, and craftswomen at the fourth, ready to replace a spoiled seam. Even behind the far doors, which the townsfolk considered to be the rough exit, there were cooks and water carriers, and their names were on the duty roster. It was necessary to deprive the hall of all these little witnesses in order to pull off the scene without being seen. But the little witnesses held their own with a sting. Remove one, and the roster becomes a whole. A holy statement led immediately to the scrutiny of the treasurer and the chancellor. The pamphlet could not count on this check, because the check loves silence and the sheet loves noise. The third layer was the closet books, whose dryness made the very possibility of an unscheduled gloss absurd. Fabrics were issued according to the principle of occasion. For prayers, one for the meeting of the synclite, another for the reception of foreigners, a third, color, length, luster, number of rows of embroidery, place of stitching. Everything was subordinated to the event and was read as a sign. In this sign could not be inserted another's plot, because it became immediately noticeable to the keeper. At times, craftswomen brought patchwork for repair, with traces of sweat and corrosion from pins. The records recorded not only the material damage, but also the hour when the patchwork was returned. These microscopic details, which from the outside seemed boring, were more effective than any defense. If a piece of cloth and a change of pin are recorded to the exact hour, there is no room for unrecorded brilliance and for a free gesture that attracts a legend. The fourth layer is doctors' reservations and safety precautions. Years had accumulated experience. Lacing too tight restricted breathing. Long standing on unlined marble cut backs with pain. Gilded thread dusted. Medical records were rationalized rather than dramatized. During cold periods, padding was strengthened. Lacing was loosened, and the heaviness of embroidery was distributed lower. Route adjustments appeared in the service logs to shorten stays in windy passages. These little things made the protocol not a tool of pretension, but a tool of survival. And in this logic, the body of a grown woman did not become an object of legend because its movements were dictated not by caprice or temptation, but by a set of measures for the stability of the overall form. The legend is uncomfortable, admitting that behind the lightness of step was a doctor's note, and behind the new shade of fabric was an order to postpone celebrations and change the lighting so as not to provoke migraines in the servants. Next came the accounting vision. Wage and lighting sheets invisibly sealed everything that took place in the halls. The names of maids, eunuchs, scribes, and chest keepers stretched before the treasurer's eyes every decade. Any scandal in the interpretation of the street required someone to disappear from their cell in the table and remain unmarked, and that meant delaying the money. Money is not to be tolerated. Where the sheet tried to waive morality, the statement asked the money question. Who among those listed did not receive or received without reason? There was no answer. In this silence, the noise of the sheet faded. The chronicle, written by a grown woman, learned to hear this very silence of numbers in words. If the accounts add up, the sheet has no event. On the climactic day of the confrontation, the Chancery decided to display the bundles of documents in order, as if a textbook example for those who knew how to look. On a long table lay the statutes of ceremonies, guard registers, closet books, lighting estimates, payrolls, master's notes, and short doctor's notes. A board of audience schedules and a map of the halls with marked paths were placed nearby. No one tried to answer anyone, because there was no one to answer. The sheet's voice is nameless. It was the forms and seals that spoke here. Those who wished to be convinced could run their fingers over the hours, over the lines, over the names. The picture assembled itself. At the hours named by the pamphlet, the retinue stood in their proper places, the doors were guarded, the lamps burned according to the estimate, the cloth was issued as intended. The masters brought in repairs for a late hour, because the parade line was held up for breath. The glow of the candles proved superfluous and required replacement of the wicks. Where the sheet drew a secret corridor, the map showed a service passage where cooks and water carriers were on duty. Where the leaflet demanded to read a slope, the charter explained it as a mandatory formula for bowing to the Byzantine addressee. The result was without effect, and therefore particularly persistent. On the same day, the Chancellor ordered the materials to be transferred to the archives and supplied with a brief resolution that the accusations were untenable. There were no big words, no names of enemies, not even an indication of the source of the rumors. They left only the date in words, the list of bundles, numbers of seals, and names of halls. This emotionlessness was enough to make the benches, still buzzing in the morning, grow weary by evening. The opposition tried to start a new sheet, but it repeated the old one, and so grew old at the same hour. The courtyard, as before, remained a cold machine, where the desire of the crowd found no gap. It is here that the role of the female gaze offered by the author becomes clear. He is not embarrassed by dryness and does not crave dramas, because he sees in the fabric and the step the language of the institution. He knows the price of pain and fatigue, does not idealize punishment and discipline, but understands the benefits of form, the protection of the adult body by the norm, the predictability of the path, the assurance of time. He distinguishes between the myth that the novel seeks and the document that holds the bridges. And so, when the city once again considers explaining its woes with someone else's promiscuity, this gaze will once again go to the tables where the bundles lie. Out of these bundles comes neither a confession nor a sermon, but a simple, anxious, but honest line. Lamps burned at the proper hour, carpets lay on their markings, keys returned to their chests, duties matched wages. In such a picture of the world, there can be scandal only where there is no paper. And in the Grand Palace, which Anna reads as an archive, there is paper almost everywhere. The final touch before the outcome is to record the aftermath. No one was rewarded for a day spent collecting evidence, but several people were penalized for careless entries. One scribe did not put in a word about closing the veils. One craftswoman delayed a flap in repair and did not mark the hour of return. This was the cruelty of the system, but it was also its insurance. Where gossip called for spectacle, the system responded with its own pain. Accuracy was paid for with tension. It paid for the defense of dignity with costs. The female gaze does not hide this cost. It accepts it as a condition of security for a form that, for all its inflexibility, has again withstood the blow of the sheets. Next, the court's archive will do what it does best: set the bundle aside, and in years to come, it will once more destroy the repeated myth, because names, clocks, and seals age slowly, but legend ages quickly. By evening, that day had shrunk to a few lines. The lamps went out on schedule, the carpets stayed on their marks, the sheaf of documents lay in the archive with seals and date initialed. Pamphlets dried up like noise after a fair, for they found no hour, no name, and no place. A few people took penalties for sloppy entries, and that was the end of the storm. The system paid with its own pain, but held the form. The female gaze, persistent and sober, recorded the outcome not as a victory over the enemy, but as a preserved order in which the adult body remained a badge of office rather than the object of someone else's fiction. The myth of promiscuity is once again shattered by cold spreadsheets and keys in chests, and this, too, is the choice of people: to be on duty, to record, to check, to endure fatigue instead of spectacle. This is how the day closes, without fanfare, but with the assurance that tomorrow the lamps will be lit on time and the carpet will not move a single step too far.